an abbreviated introduction. Our first speaker is Orion, who's a permaculture designer, teacher, homesteader, and mother living in the southern Willamette Valley of Oregon. She's the author of Beyond the War on Invasive Species, a permaculture approach to ecosystem restoration. And I'm not going to read the rest. I'm just going to let her start talking.
Research and also my observation and work with landscapes and restoration. My observation is that invasive species co-occur with other land-based processes, whether that's too much disturbance, a lack of disturbance, other changes in the environment such as nutrient inputs, sedimentation, changes in hydrological regimes. There's all kinds of different things that have happened in the wake of the last 500 years or so in North America, post-colonization by European immigrants, that have changed the nature of ecosystem processes in very significant ways. So invasive species as a kind of singling them out for their effects on biological diversity doesn't exactly tell the whole story. And some of the things that I spoke about earlier, some of the ways that they're being approached in terms of land management by applying herbicide and other pesticides in the case of non-plant invasive species are leading to further ecological degradation. So it's a significant issue. And it's an increasing issue as people are becoming more and more concerned with the kind of integrity and health of biological systems. The idea that invasive species are the causal agents of observed changes in ecosystems leads people, land managers of all sorts, to believe that they need to remove them immediately, and this often comes in the form of herbicide. And, you know, it's a very interesting. Oh. One of the things that I found about this, there's a few interesting narratives here. The first being that some of the research, as you know, some of the other speakers today have touched on, there's very little research devoted to organic or pesticide-free approaches in agriculture. There's almost none in the field of ecological restoration. Most of the science that comes out about invasive species and their management is funded by the pesticide industry. And even organizations like the Nature Conservancy partner with Monsanto to develop protocols for invasive species management on their land holdings. And the Nature Conservancy, ironically enough, received a third of Rachel Carson's estate upon her death. And now, you know, it's up on their website. One of their corporate partners is Monsanto. It's very ironic and sad. And concerning because, you know, the whole kind of paradigm of restoration and what we're looking at on the kind of broad scale ecological management is arbitrated by pesticide manufacturers who have a lot to gain by expanding their markets into, quote, vegetation management schemes outside of agriculture. So an interesting thing about the Princeton study, you know, the seminal study, the first greatest threat to biodiversity is habitat destruction. And, you know, that's probably why we don't hear about it as much. You know, it's kind of intuitive. We probably all understand that. But I find it interesting in conversations about invasive species and what we should do about them that there's a lot of things that we kind of see in our landscape that we take for granted as normal or business as usual, like this is just how things are done in our system. You know, we have agriculture and we grow 90 million acres of corn, 85 million acres of soy, 80 million acres of wheat. That's our economy. And I feel like that's kind of an interesting piece of this whole discussion because that amount of acreage, just in those three crops, covers far more land than any invasive species, and indeed all invasive species, if you added that together, the cumulative acreage that's covered by these plants, in that case, is far less than just those three crops. And so I encourage everybody to kind of think about the perspective of what's really driving biodiversity loss and how we can think about our production systems, as other speakers have talked about today, as reservoirs of biodiversity. That's what we really need to be thinking about. And doing it, making those changes in agriculture, in the way we design cities, the way we design suburbs, the way we have animals and raise animals for meat and dairy. All of those things, if they're done well and done in a kind of holistic or whole systems context, will eventually provide less niches for some of the tenacious invasive species that we are seeing pop up everywhere, because a lot of them come into places that have been poorly managed, or they're kind of like downstream effects of our larger lack of whole systems design approaches to the ways that we live our lives. And in many cases, as I said, attempts to eradicate them without addressing the underlying root of why they're there in the first place can have further ecological effects. And to some extent, it's kind of perpetuating the pesticide treadmill, or it's just, it's not really getting to the root of the issue, which is, if native species are declining in an area, invasive species are a piece of that, but they're not the whole story. There are reasons why native species are not doing as well. Some of them may relate to climate change. Increasing CO2 concentration has been shown to affect certain invasive species by increasing their growth. There's other evidence, other studies coming out that are showing that the rate of ecological succession, or the way that ecosystems change over time, is making early succession type ecosystems more prevalent. So most invasive species are early succession type plants, so they're the pioneer species that are just kind of, that come on the scene post-disturbance. They have deep taproots, they're thorny. Even the shrubby type invasive species like buckthorn, or, there's a few of them, kudzu being a vine type, are kind of early mid-successional type of plants, if you look at them from an objective kind of ecological perspective. So to some degree, the effects of climate change, which we're just starting to understand and be able to project, are affecting ecosystems in unknown ways, and we need to be thinking about that as well. This is a kind of iceberg model of systems thinking, and that's an approach that I use to research and kind of put forward some ideas about solutions to restoration and invasive species management. When we see something, an event, like an invasive species proliferating in an area, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's one aspect that's supported by many other ecosystem processes, land use history, changes in rainfall, changes in, maybe there's been an influx of nitrogen into the system from leaky septic tanks over the past 50 years that's contributing to the influx of Phragmites, which is, I understand, an invasive species that is proliferating around here. Japanese knotweed is another one that has some relationship with excess nitrogen in riparian systems. So if you can kind of look at what's happening from a larger scale perspective, you can start to see how some of the changes that you make in the design of your systems can affect the proliferation of invasive species. Perhaps subdivisions or even households should start thinking about installing living machines to deal with their human waste in creative ways that aren't polluting waterways, and that's going to have all of these other beneficial ecological outcomes, besides making it so the wetlands aren't overtaken by Phragmites. So there's reasons for their proliferation, and we need to start to be able to understand those in order to make good management decisions. And there's lots of good research that's been done about specific invasive species, and I encourage people to look at it, but look at the research that's been done with an eye towards kind of whole systems analysis. Oftentimes, a lot of the research is, at the end of it, when you read the discussion section, it says, well, these are obviously negative. They have negative ecological interactions because of the findings that we've shown. But if you can kind of take that, what I think is bias out, will show you a better way potentially forward to understanding the role of these species in our ecosystems right now. So.
Thank you.
Oh.
I'll be giving this mic to Kristin. Well, you've all heard Kristin speak. She's the author of The Soil Will Save Us, and I'm just going to let her speak.
I don't have a PowerPoint. Even the one I had last night had big gaps in it. It's a technology I haven't quite caught up to yet. So, you know, I talked last night about this soil health movement that's really going on all over the world, and it kind of people are always asking me, well, what are the main things? Boil it down to 3 points, and so I do have it boiled down to 4 points, even though I think that's anyway, a silly way to approach things. But you know, the first thing that all of these soil health innovators and pioneers are doing is that they're trying to disturb the soil as little as possible, because they understand that there's that incredibly alive, active, vibrant ecosystem under our feet, the ecosystem under our feet, and that those microorganisms that are in that ecosystem, from fungi to bacteria and all those other little creatures are moving things around, moving messages around, moving communication around, moving water around, moving nutrients around. And so they want to, and they've also created those spaces in the soil that hold water and air. And so they're trying to respect that underground ecosystem as much as possible and not disturb it. And then the second thing is that they're trying to keep the soil covered at all time. Trying to keep that pelt of vegetation on the soil all the time, trying to keep photosynthesis going all the time, because if photosynthesis isn't going, then those soil microorganisms are not getting the food that they need to carry on their work. And like when I was working on the book, every once in a while I would sort of procrastinate by thinking of t-shirt slogans related to the book, and I thought, like instead of boots on the ground, roots in the ground, if you want to help another kind of roots in the ground. Or vegetate, it's supposed to be a bad thing. Don't vegetate. Vegetate, that's a good thing. So we want to have as much photosynthesis going on all the time as much as possible. And respecting biodiversity, respecting plant biodiversity on the top of the ground, and that also contributing to the biodiversity of the microorganisms under the ground. And also respecting the full gamut of biodiversity, the lands, the more natural lands that we revere and that we want our agricultural lands to sort of look like. They did not, they had animals moving on them. They had, not just plants and soil and some fungi, but they also had animals moving over them. And they have insects, and so we want to support that full biodiversity below ground, above ground. So those are, and we also, of course, we want to lay off the chemicals as much as possible, because those chemicals interfere with those natural relationships that go on among the microorganisms and the plants and the fungi and the animals. So that makes it sound very simple, but of course it's very hard. Agriculture is really hard. And it comes down to tricks and management tactics and that all fit within this approach of trying to respect the health of the soil and build the health of the soil, but lots of different ways of going about it. So there's a guy I wrote about in the book named Abe Collins. Do any of you know him? Yeah, so he's a soil health evangelist, I guess. He's a soil health, really a brilliant thinker and sort of soil health evangelist and innovator. And he has this, and so he always talks about there being like 40 different tools of building soil health. That within those principles, that there are like 40 different ways that you can go about it. And no-till agriculture would be one tool, and cover crops is another tool, and compost might be another tool, and all this stuff. And he has this great, when I was interviewing him a couple of years ago for the book, I think some of these plans are big and take a while. So that means I've gone 5 minutes, or I have
both,
okay.
actually.
So he has this great idea. So he loves to talk about farmers being great innovators, and because things are so different and people are different, and conditions are different, and seeds planted in one place may behave differently than when they're planted someplace else, and so he has this great perspective on farmers and their ingenuity. He talks about every day, there's enough innovation that's developed and lost on farms around the world that's comparable to the loss of knowledge when the library in Alexandria burned down. So he's trying to do something about changing that. So he's working on it, and it's not done yet. I just emailed him earlier in the day saying, hey, you got that thing finished yet? And no, he doesn't quite have it finished yet. But he's trying to come up with something that's kind of like, that web interactive thing next door.
Yeah.
So it's like a thing that it's like a Facebook thing, only it's for neighborhoods. But and what he's working on is like a Facebook next door kind of thing for farmers, so that people can share innovations. And so that the farmer that we visited the other day, who talks about Maine being too cold for no-till agriculture, can talk to farmers maybe in Canada about how they have worked around some of those obstacles and what ideas they've come up with. And people do come up with great ideas all the time, like that. He was talking about spraying his crops with raw milk. He didn't say raw milk, but milk.
Yeah.
Raw milk. I mean, that is an innovation that a farmer out in the Midwest came up with, and it was just sort of an accident. He had taken off the cream because that was what he could sell, and he had this leftover raw milk and sort of dumped it on the grass, and whoa, everything started to grow like crazy. And so now farmers all over the country are doing that. So anyway, I think that we can look forward to more of this great agricultural innovation that's going on with social media.
I know not. Could you just tell me again the name of that person that you're talking about?
Abe Collins.
Abe Collins. Thank you so much.
I might have called him Gabe. Every once in a while I fuse the two of them together.
Okay. Our next speaker hasn't spoken before here. This is Ann Burd, who is the Environmental Health Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. She directs the center's efforts to protect humans and all other species from the harmful effects of toxic substances. She has a BA from Colorado College and her JD from Lewis and Clark School. Before joining the center, she worked as a staff attorney and campaign manager for the Portland-based nonprofit Bark to Protect Forests, Rivers, and Wildlife, and then as a contract attorney for the National Wildlife Federation, focusing on mountaintop removal, coal mining, and tar sands pipelines, and the Center for Food Safety, where she focused on pesticides and genetic engineering. She sits on the boards of NEDC and the Cragg Law Center. This is Ann.
Thanks.
You need this.
I'm going to try to balance holding this in this hand and this in this hand and try not to make the slideshow go. I'll try not to stand.
I'll turn pages.
Yeah, just to remind me. I think it's useful to know where we're coming from. So I'm going to read you guys our mission. And I will hold this and not speak into this. I'm going to try really hard. We approach these issues from the perspective of trying to prevent extinction. So at the Center for Biological Diversity, we believe that the welfare of human beings is deeply linked to nature, to the existence in our world of a vast diversity of wild animals and plants. Because diversity has intrinsic value and because its loss impoverishes society, We work to secure a future for all species, great and small, hovering on the brink of extinction. We want those who come after us to inherit a world that is still alive. So the focus of our work on pesticides is very much in line with that focus on battling the 6th great extinction crisis that Jonathan Lundgren spoke about earlier today. And yeah, extinction, it's for good. So we constantly feel like the stakes are very, very high in our work. Paige touched on the Endangered Species Act earlier, so I won't belabor it. But I'll just read you a line from the Supreme Court that all Endangered Species Act attorneys read to themselves before bed at night, so we feel like we can live to fight another day. This was a case where a multi-million-dollar dam was stopped on behalf of a little fish called the snail darter. The plain intent of Congress in enacting the statute was to halt and reverse the trend towards species extinction, whatever the cost. So, how does the Endangered Species Act stop extinction? Why is it 99% effective at stopping extinction? Because the Endangered Species Act says that every single time a federal agency takes an action that may endanger the lives of threatened or endangered species, it has to figure out what those effects are. And that figuring out process is called consultation. So you'll hear me talk about consultation. It's the theme of my life, basically. And that consultation is to ensure that the action that's taken is not going to drive the species to extinction, or the language of the statute is to jeopardize the continued existence of the species, or to result in the destruction or adverse modification of the species' habitat. And in that process of consultation, the agency has to give the species the benefit of the doubt, because these are the species that we've determined are the most imperiled species in the nation and in the world. And that process is the action agency first figures out what the effects might be of its action, and then it brings it to the expert agency. So if it's a terrestrial animal or plant, that's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If it's a sea creature, that's the National Marine Fisheries Service. And we work on all species, the ones that no one cares about. We work a ton on freshwater mussels, cute creatures with faces, creatures without faces, all of them. So unsurprisingly, pesticides have pretty significant effects on threatened and endangered species. One of the other things that this Endangered Species Act does is it says that once a species is listed under the Act, a recovery plan should be made, so we figure out what effects, what we can do to bring the species back from the brink. So 185 recovery plans for wildlife mention pesticides as a threat, 85 recovery plans for plants list species, pesticides as a threat. And one of the species most recently listed because of the threat of pesticides is the Dakota skipper, listed under the Act in 2014 due in part to the danger of neonicotinoids. And I'll just mention, a lot of people think of areas of heavy ag use as kind of dead zones. But there are still species living on the edges of those ag zones, and as we continue to expand, as we continue to degrade habitat and use more pesticides in those areas, they are increasingly imperiled. So it's not like we've killed everything and there's nothing left to protect. That sad puppy is how I feel about Ewe4ic. Ewe4ic is our, as Paige mentioned earlier today, the law that governs pesticide use in this country and EPA's mandate in regulating pesticides. And it's a cost-benefit analysis and leans very heavily towards EPA registering pesticides and allowing their continuing use because the standard is unreasonable adverse effect on the environment, and that gives the agency a lot of deference, and it gives pesticide companies a lot of room to push the agency. So in carrying out its responsibilities under Ewe4ic, the EPA has quite unfortunately completely neglected its responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act. Like I said, any time an agency takes an action that may harm species, it has to engage in this consultation process, and EPA's response to that is like, oh, that's really hard. I mean, there are so many species, we use these pesticides everywhere, it's very complicated, expensive. We'll totally get to that later. And later never comes. And so we, this is something we've been heavily engaged in. The very first thing we do, the threshold thing we do, is we comment on every single pesticide registration, and there are a lot of them. If you think that federal agencies can't move fast, you should see how fast they move on pesticide registrations. Sometimes registering them within 5 days of the comment period closing has happened a few months ago. And in every single one of these comments, Nate very often says the exact same thing. You need to consult under the Endangered Species Act. And they're like, yeah, totally. Like mañana or some other time, maybe. So that leaves us to no other option but to push for Endangered Species Act consultation on these creatures. And all of these creatures are creatures that we have litigation going to protect: the California red-legged frog, whooping crane, Heinz emerald, dragonfly, and Louisiana black bears. So there are two kind of main veins of our Endangered Species Act consultation litigation for pesticides, and each one is its own special snowflake. And I will just run through the 5 very briefly that we are litigating over the new registrations. And because I know you're going to ask, I will tell you the way we choose them, and we choose very few of the new registrations, is the worst of the worst, the nastiest of the nasties, or what we go after, the ones where we really have no choice. The first one, CTP, we are represented by Earth Justice and joined by Center for Food Safety and Defenders of Wildlife on very highly toxic new insecticide, imperils 20 endangered butterflies, very nasty stuff. Fluopyridiferon was billed by EPA and the pesticide industry as a new systemic insecticide that's better for bees. So why is it better for bees? It is better for bees because it is so incredibly toxic that they just drop dead when they're exposed to it. So this is super awesome in the minds of EPA and the pesticide industry because they won't bring the poison back to the hive. But what they don't think about were the 4,337 species of native bees, most of which are solitary, and when they drop dead, their broods die and everything's over for them, and they're tanking. So we're suing over this one. And people ask where we get our information, like, are we doing our studies? No, it's actually from EPA. They're the ones who are doing this, and they didn't consult. And as you can see, yes, indirect effects on every single taxa of species. And they say, yeah, this in the registration, they say this probably has effects on endangered species, so you should totally consult the Endangered Species Bulletin, where you'll get information about these effects. But the bulletin only exists if you have done consultation, and they haven't, so there's no bulletin. Bicyclopyrone, super nasty stuff. It was a deal between industry and EPA. They said, well, Syngenta, we really want you to phase out atrazine, it's so bad. And Syngenta was like, yeah, totally, we'll do that, that's a good idea. Register this new product for us. It will help us get out of the need for using atrazine. So they register one product when they initially register this stuff. It's called Acuron, and it is a mix of bicyclopyrone with atrazine in the same bottle. And the bottle says, if this doesn't work well enough, just add atrazine. Benzo, another nasty one. Cuprous iodide, copper-based antimicrobial. We spend billions of dollars on salmon recovery. Copper is horrible for salmon. And we approved this because it will make your socks not stink if you don't wash them and you wear them for too many days. So we could just wash our socks more frequently. Then there is the old registrations that we're litigating over. Starting in 2002, the California red-legged frog cases, and I will circle back to those in just a minute because we have some good results to report. In 2014, we launched our nationwide pesticide case with PANA, taking on EPA for its failure to consider the impacts of hundreds of pesticides on endangered species. So those are the old registrations. And if you are so inclined, please keep a little spot in your heart for us. On May 13th, we're going before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to argue that case. So think of us, please.
Wow.
So these are some of the settlements that have come from our California old registration cases, starting with the red-legged frog. And these we've all achieved settlements on where we are going to get Endangered Species Act consultation. And this matters because once the consultation happens, they are going to have no choice but to say, these species are going to go extinct if you keep using this, and you have to dramatically limit your pesticide use, especially in their habitat. So we anticipate big pesticide use reductions. So 2 of the pesticides that are most famous on this list are atrazine and glyphosate. Together, those are 40% of our nation's total pesticide use, and we will have consultation complete on those 2 from EPA in 2020 and from Fish and Wildlife Service in 2022. So that sounds like a long time, but we're looking at over 1,700 listed species, and these are complex analyses. So we fought hard. This was the best we could get. Just last week, we got our first 3 draft consultation documents from EPA on chlorpyrifos, malathion, and diazinon. So what did they find? We're in this business all day. We know these things have horrible effects. We sue over them over and over and over. Even we were shocked. 97% of all listed species, over 1,700, are likely to be adversely affected by malathion and chlorpyrifos. 79% by diazinon. So unbelievable results. Of course, you all know that these are all nasty old organophosphates. 85% of umbilical cord samples test positive for these, 87, we've called for a ban, many of you guys have as well. So we're working hard on their phase out, but unbelievable levels of effects. And we need to stand really strong with EPA as it does this. So we've gotten some really positive media for them, and we're going to do everything to back them in this process. Hugely important that other people back them as well, because this was really, really sticking their necks out. And the pesticide industry, I guarantee you, is losing their minds right now. 97%, over 1,700 listed species. This will result in massive reductions in pesticide use, especially once they start looking at other nasty old pesticides as well. Oh, and a grizzly bear, because it's cute and necessary. So some next steps. We are going to continue commenting on every single new pesticide registration, every registration review, every risk assessment. It's a huge amount of work, but very often no one else does it. So if we don't, then we lose the ability to take action on them. We also will continue to litigate over the worst new pesticide registrations and our existing litigation. We just on Friday intervened on EPA's behalf in the cancellation of a nasty pesticide called clopidogrel. 8 years ago, Bayer made a deal with EPA. They tried to register this new pesticide. EPA said, oh, it's so bad for aquatic species, but we're not 100% certain that it's so bad, so we're going to conditionally register it pending new studies on aquatic species, and then we'll see what happens. Like, oh, it looks pretty bad. Anyway, 8 years later, they came to Bayer and they were like, oh, this is really bad. We have tons of studies showing this is really bad. Do what you said you would do and yank this product. And Bayer was like, how could you say such a bad thing about clopidogrel? It's totally a nice product. I'm making lots of profit. And they were very upset about this request, and we just filed in court, before the ALJ, Administrative Law Judge of EPA, supporting EPA's decision on that, and they're moving forward. And we will work really hard to ensure the integrity of these initial ESA consultations. Join our list if you'd like, and you'll get notifications on how you can submit comments as well. And thank you very much, and I think we'll hold our questions until after the last speaker. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is the Gypsy Goat Lady.
Thanks, Karen. So, first of all, I want to say it's an honor to be with these great women. And Dow, I have your book.
Nice.
And Kristin, I'm going to buy yours. And thanks for your great work, Lori. And I also want to honor some very powerful women that are my friends, Terry, Paula, and Josie. And some new very powerful women, Nikita and Jen, and everyone else in the room too. It's great to be here. So I'm just going to run through a reclamation job on a 100-year-old roadbed in the worst drought of the century at that time. There's been 3 more worse since then. So the county road came in off from the highway and came in through here, and these people decided they wanted to build a lodge. So I was going to revegetate this. Tunnel vision, just like Dow said. How do we do things? Well, we got to use machinery and chemicals. but that's not how I do things. So set up some electric fence. Remember, this is a 100-year-old roadbed and it's dirt, so the compaction of people driving on this for over 100 years, and the experts told me that there's no way that this would be possible without taking a plow or giant machinery and ripping that dirt up. So of course I did it my own way, and I didn't do that. I could only find 7 bales of oat hay to use for mulch, and I put the seed out and just put the mulch on it, and these goats were run up on that mountain, that sheep mountain. The goats were run up on the mountain to eat, and then at night we'd bring them down and put them here and, you know, empty the intestines overnight, and that's how I did it in the worst drought of the century. That was in 2001. I went here once a year to this ranch. Over the years, I only showed up once a year whenever I was going by. And in 2004, there were lots of weeds there. We thought all the seed was gone. By 2007, when I went through there, it was looking pretty good. And of course, I try to get 1 million pounds per acre because, like Kristin says, as is above, so should be below. So I want 1 million pounds of earthworms per acre to match my 1 million pounds of goats above, plus everyone else who lives there. But it should be equal, the life above and below. And this is what it looked like in 2008. So 7 years, the worst drought of the century. This was the middle of that old roadbed. And I did it my way. I used no machinery. I came once a year only with that kind of impact. Back to 01, looking down, this is where the road went in and my little bales. And the goats in, scattered the seed. 04 again, you can see these biennial weeds showing up, which they put horses in there and rotated them when I was gone. And this is where I knew I had 1 million, well, it was almost 1 million. It was just right under 1 million pounds per acre. I had 1,600 goats here on 1/6 of an acre. And I calculated the weight. So this is the closest I've ever been to 1 million pounds per acre. It's really hard to hold them when you get them that tight. So again there, and looking down, that's the kind of density, and we had lots of clovers and things in there. This was right on that old roadbed, which was as hard as this. The key, poop, urine, and hoof action. And living tools. There it is again. You gotta feed the system. Build the nutrition, build the soil, hold the water. And that's all I'm going to say about that, but back to what I think you were saying, Kristin, or no, you. Well, anyway, when I went to grad school at Colorado State University, I was the only student not funded by a chemical company. The only student, and I was the poor kid. They got so much money. I got $1,000 a month. I had 2 little boys to raise by myself, single mother. I got $1,000 a month, and I had to pay my own tuition, books, and fees. Everybody else in the department, and I was 36 years old when I got there also, but everybody else in the department, funded by a chemical company, got all their books, tuition, and fees paid for. They had hats, coats, and everything by the chemical companies. They were wined and dined, 3 boxes of donuts every Monday morning in the lab, and $30,000 a year cash. Whoa. Is what they got. When the chemical company funds your research, they give you the question, and your only job as a student is to answer the question. It has nothing to do with your opinion or anything. You answer that question. You're given 4 choices. You know, so when the chemical company owns the research, the question is, how much should we use? That's the question. A pint to the acre, a quart to the acre, spray spring or fall, or both spring and fall, a quart to the acre. And you're going to get one of those answers because that's how research is done. Is you answer the question and those are your answer choices. No other choices. So all of that research owned by the chemical companies is on the shelf, and when the national, we call them the Fish and Wildlife Circus. Fish and Wildlife Circus, BLM, these big land managers, private landowners, you know, when they're looking for answers, they pull the research off the shelf, and it says there, you know, what is the answer here? You got to spray Tordon twice a year, quart to the acre, and so then it's misinterpreted when the private landowner calls in and says, I've got thistles in my meadow, in my horse pasture, what do I do? What's the best thing to do for thistles in a horse pasture? They pull that off and it says here you have to spray Tordon twice a year, quart to the acre. Well, that's not really what it said, and that's not how they got to that answer, but it gets misinterpreted. And the good people who are trying to do a good job and help the people who are in the local weed offices. By the way, weed's legal in Colorado now. But the county weed people and the county extension agents are trying to do their job that, may not even know how research is done, are, they're trying to do their work. But the chemical companies are so powerful, their marketing is so strong, and they own all the research. And that's how that information hits the ground, and then they have all these disciples that they have funded. So anyway, that's how it gets misinterpreted. So we just have to stay out there and keep doing our work. And also from Dow and your slides, most of the time when I go to a job and bid a job and I see 4 million acres of cheatgrass, it's there because they sprayed Tordon out of an airplane 20 years ago to kill something. And so everywhere I go, when I see their problem, they have built the problem and maintained it and managed for that problem by their practices. Thank you.
Okay, we have lots of time for questions. That was the idea. So, somebody have a question?
Can I ask you, how do you move 1 million pounds of goat around?
Border Collies.
I mean, but from one big site to another.
Well, I prefer to walk down the highway right away.
We need you guys.
Oh, I'm sorry. How do I move the goats around? Ford-X semis, or we walk. We walk across the country. I could walk across this whole country in the right-of-way system of the highways and have quite a bit. This gets pretty wild in Western, but only a good border collie. But Ford-X semis take us most places.
Just follow up. So you didn't have to use 1 million pounds of goats. You used whatever pounds per the size of that space, or did you actually have 1 million pounds of goats?
It was that. It was.
Oh, that's.
Was 1,600 goats on 1/6 of an acre,
Oh, so
which
quite-
the weight of them calculated to be 980,000 pounds.
I'm wondering when they were on that 1/6 of an acre, how long they stayed?
2 hours.
Okay.
Wow.
That's all. That's the important thing, the duration.
Yes. And when you have that kind of intensity, you can move really fast, and that's the very best work I do, is that kind of intensity and move as fast as I can go.
Okay, a silly question. Why are the excrements of goats are good and not of dogs? We are supposed to pick up dog poops.
Goats are vegetarians.
So are most.
Dogs are
Okay.
carnivores.
Over here.
Making you run the room.
Lori, I wanted to ask you, do you know what the status is of putting the monarch butterfly on the endangered species list? I know there was a move to do that.
Yeah,
Don't touch it.
we got a positive, we petitioned along with the Ewe4ic Society and the Center for Food Safety for the monarch butterfly to be listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, with lots of room for backyard monarch people to continue doing that, but primarily because glyphosate and Roundup Ready crops Roundup Ready crops are designed for an over-the-top spraying of glyphosate, as probably everyone here knows. And glyphosate is a uniquely potent killer of monarch butterflies. And so glyphosate is one of the leading threats to monarch butterflies in this incredible extinction. And we saw a 90% decline the year that we submitted that listing petition. The numbers have rebounded a little bit.
right now, but we got a positive 90-day finding from Fish and Wildlife Service and sued over the 12-month finding because they didn't meet their deadline. So that's where we're at, continuing to push it, and it's led to all kinds of interesting monarch initiatives because, of course, people, for rightly or wrongly, are very concerned about having monarchs listed under the Act, and so there are a lot of efforts now. But none of the efforts that are underway are addressing the root cause of massive glyphosate spraying on Roundup Ready crops. And so all the highway plantings and all the people planting milkweed in their backyards, which, you know, I'm planting milkweed in my backyard like everyone. So I'm not discounting those efforts, but all of those efforts will never be able to overcome the fact that, you know, the over-the-top spraying of millions of acres of crops with Roundup is driving this decline.
Well, yeah.
Okay, a quick comment. There's some laws that sound very, very good on paper. In practice, can be terrible. And one example of that is the no net loss of wetlands Act. It was passed about 20 years ago in Congress, and it says that when wetlands are destroyed, you have to either restore or replace the equivalent or greater amount of wetlands to make up for to compensate for the loss. It sounds like a very good law. It seems very reasonable. In practice, around the country, where I know particularly in New Jersey, the outcome has actually been billions of pounds of glyphosate being sprayed in wetlands, tidal wetlands all around the fringes of New Jersey, because what ends up happening is that people can identify Phragmites as a degraded species, which is actually oversimplified. The reality is far more complex than that. But that becomes an excuse if a mall builder wants to build 100 acres of mall to go ahead and build them all, and then they'll spray a few hundred acres of Phragmites replanted in Spartina and claim that now they've fulfilled no net loss of wetlands. And actually, we have double the loss. We've got the loss of the mall building, plus now the damage to the ecosystem from the massive spraying. So it's an example of the sort of thing that looks good, it sounds good on paper, but in reality, it's often terrible. I noticed in your book you have to discuss Phragmites as an issue, but it's a remarkable one. There's really much, this isn't the time for it, there's much to be said about it, because it's not nearly as simple as the media makes it out.
Did you want to respond? You've actually got a mic.
Oh, yeah, I actually got my start in thinking about this when I got a job on a wetland mitigation project in Oregon, and just saw the scope of the project was, you know, to nuke the site for 3 years with Roundup after it had been excavated down to wetland characteristics, so it had standing groundwater, in order to be able to expand the landfill. So the landfill is on an existing wetland, intact, and they made this other one. And, you know, it's kind of a bait and switch kind of thing, and, you know, hundreds of pounds of herbicide were used in the process of creating this semi-functional wetland. You know, it's there now, but it's kind of a figment of what the landfill is now going to be built on. So, yeah, it's definitely a big issue.
Did you want to respond? No. Okay.
So I have a question for Lori Ann. So I read an article about the Endangered Species Act. Oh, results. And this is probably for development projects, so it might be quite different, but they were saying that consultations, you know, have very rarely resulted in stopping a project, and usually it just results in minor modifications. So do you see that as being different with your pesticide, pesticide challenges, and if so, why? Or, you know, are you concerned that they'll go through this consultation process and come out with something that isn't really doing very much?
Thanks for asking that, Paula. You know, a lot of times people really freak out about the Endangered Species Act and that it's going to ruin their lives and stop economic development and will, you know, be a horrible catastrophe. And we've heard that a lot in, a number of contexts. But The reality is that the vast majority of the time, TVAV Hill excluded, the Endangered Species Act consultation leads to modifications in how the project will be carried out that allow the project to move forward, but also protect the interests of the listed species. So with the registrations, with the existing registrations and the Endangered Species Act consultation that we're doing there, I anticipate buffers, and a lot of them. So, but the buffers, like, the proof will be in the pudding. Like, how can you use atrazine anywhere near endangered species? You know, we know that the level that is of atrazine that EPA allows in our drinking water is enough to cause, you know, sex changes in frogs. And so any use of atrazine, I imagine, you know, near those kinds of aquatic species and herps in particular, I don't think will be allowed. Once consultation is completed, I think it'll have really significant impacts on atrazine. So I think with the existing pesticides, it will lead to buffers and reductions. With the new pesticide registrations, I have no idea how it's going to go. The first case, CTP, we ran into some significant jurisdictional issues to bore you all to pieces. Well, I won't bore you all to pieces, how's that? But we're working them out. It's gone up on appeal, and we're briefing through the summer. So we'll figure that out, and then we'll get to merits, and then we'll start moving on this series of 5 cases. But I think it has yet to be determined whether they'll call jeopardy on these, and if they do, then we just won't be able to use them anywhere near those species, and maybe they'll just get yanked. I don't know, but I don't anticipate it'll lead to, you know, all pesticides being immediately taken off the market. But I do anticipate some substantive changes.
Somebody else?
Anyone has a thought? Thanks. On the way here, I started listening to Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, and the first case that she talks about is of frogs and toads, and leaves it as it's a fungus that's causing this, that's been moving around the world because of an African frog that's been used for frog's legs or something. But I read somewhere about neonicotinoids in California being associated with loss of amphibians or frogs. I'm just wondering if anyone knows of any other explanation. I mean, we know neonicotinoids depress the immune system in at least some organisms, so I'm just wondering about those kinds of course, this extinction of frogs started in the 80s. Before that chemical family was widespread, but I was like wondering what other explanations there might be for this. Since I always like to look for chemicals as a root cause.
Does anybody have an answer?
You should answer.
I'm reticent to speak about neonicotinoids in Mr. Lundgren's presence because whatever I say, he would say 10 times better. But I will say, you know, what you mentioned earlier, habitat loss is the #1 threat to species, and we have drained so many wetlands and destroyed so much habitat for frogs. And so, yeah, habitat loss is the leading driver of all extinctions. And then, yeah, pesticides. From what I've seen so far, and neonicotinoids are relatively new, they're not a leading cause of driving off frogs yet. We'll probably see more research, and disease is a huge factor, but habitat loss, I would say, is the top factor. Disease, I mean, with all species extinctions, you know, people love to say, like, oh, the enviros are saying neonics are driving everything extinct, and that's just not true, and we never say that. There are a lot of complex causes, so with bees, habitat loss is a leading driver, disease, all kinds of things, lack of forage. But neonicotinoids make everything worse for some species, so we'll see what comes out on frogs. I just saw the first neonic paper on bats a couple weeks ago, so more research coming.
There's a lot of literature about both atrazine and glyphosate with frogs by Tyrone Hayes at University of California, Berkeley, and also Grellier at University of Pittsburgh, and others. There's actually a mountain of literature.
And our California red-legged frog case addressed that, and that's how we got to atrazine and glyphosate for the consultations. So yeah, tons and tons on lots of pesticides, but I don't know about neonics specifically for frogs.
Did you have?
Sure.
Hi, I have a question for Lani about your experience at college. As you were talking, it reminded me of going to Ohio State and being really excited to study agriculture and having moved there and only to find out that everything was subsidized by Dow Chemical, and I just wanted to like cry and say, how did I do this mistake? But I made it through school, and I just heard that Ohio State is pledging $100 million for sustainable agriculture across the whole department. And then they are naming Brian Snyder from PASA, Pennsylvania Sustainable Ag Association. So I was thrilled, and I just can't even believe it. So to me, it was like, oh, just this big shift happening. So do you think that there are shifts happening where you're not going to see like every student being subsidized by a chemical company, like it's a basketball scholarship or something?
Yes, I do, but the shift I see happening is with this new generation of children, is where I see it. But I do see it happening, yes. But when I was in grad school and I gave my research paper at Western Society Weed Science Conference, my major professor told me that he was going to sit right behind Mary so-and-so, the Dowie Landco representative, and he said, I know she's going to ask you this, this, and this, and I'll tell you how to answer. And he sat behind her and he told me what to say. He said, I've got to have the funding for my department. And I was 39 years old when I got my master's, and I wasn't young, and I went, oh shit. Whoops, is that on film? But yeah, the tide's turning, but it's the new generation of people, I believe.
I wanted to ask Dow a question because you haven't really talked much about permaculture. And I wondered if you could say something about how you see permaculture addressing some of these issues that we've raised.
Yeah, that's an interesting, broad topic. I would say one of my interests in coming at writing the book and just kind of thinking about issues of restoration and what restoration really means, how we can do what we can in our own lives to encourage biological diversity really came from a permaculture background, which is kind of a design system based on meeting our own needs in a way that's integrated with natural systems. So I found it interesting to kind of think about conversations where people are encouraged to plant native species, for example, in their yards. And I think that that's great. But from a permaculturalist perspective, I think it would be even better if people could plant food and native species and pollinator attractive plants. Because as we've seen, the biggest drivers of habitat loss and species extinctions are these major scale corporate industrial agriculture production systems. And if we could think about shifting our land use, shifting our kind of relationship to local place, and the way that we allocate resources and energy, kind of concentrate that in the places where we are, I think that we could go a long way towards reducing the need of these type of agricultural systems. And I think also those agricultural systems need to be redesigned to be more appropriate to their place too. For example, switching corn and soy production for feeding animals in confinement back to perennial tallgrass prairie systems with large grazers integrated into those systems would be a huge step for biodiversity, water harvesting, drawing down of carbon dioxide out of the air and putting it back into the soil. And these are the kinds of things that, permaculture folks are talking about all the time. So I think that, it has multiple scales. One of the things that I found interesting in my research was that, there was a lot of interest in native plants and, their importance, but everybody just went to the store and bought food. Everybody does. I do too. And there's not a lot of focus on the native plants as useful in their ecosystem. They are also potentially food or medicine. They were used by and are used by indigenous people throughout the world for thousands of years. So if we can start to kind of think about plants in a different way too, I think that we could kind of shift some of those relationships. They're not just kind of static pieces of an ecosystem. They have functions. And I feel like if we think about them from a more interactive perspective, there's more of a potential for them to thrive. And a lot of native plants respond well to harvesting, moderate harvesting. And, there's some interesting conversations to be had about that. So, yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh, so inspiring. Yeah.
Lori, this is for you again. I wonder if you have any inside scoop on the EPA's re-registration of glyphosate, which they were supposed to let us know, I think, last July, and then it was December, and we still haven't heard anything.
What did they re-register after we sent out that nasty press release? We're still waiting. We don't know. And we sent out a press release kind of highlighting all the things that they had promised to re-register last year at the end of the year, trying to shame them, and they put out re-registration for one or two of them, which is escaping my mind right now. But I think they understand that whatever they do is going to set off a bit of a firestorm. So we'll see. On the subject of glyphosate, though, over 100 European Parliament members this week submitted urine samples before they did their glyphosate re-registration vote. I was just so inspired, and it was one of those moments where I was like, what if we in this country could, I know, every time I go down that road of being like, what if we could be more like Europe and our approach to it's just magical thinking.
For glyphosate in the urine, there's a way to do it.
Yeah, and they submitted, like, over 100 European Parliament members submitted urine samples for glyphosate.
And they're going to
it was
get the
just,
results?
yeah, this week they submitted them, so it's just so cool to see how other places are approaching this issue and seeing a lot of momentum on glyphosate around the world.
We're going to be announcing results of urine testing for glyphosate probably by the end of this month, and the results are going to blow people's minds.
Let's see, I think you mentioned.
Thank you. My name is Brian Jordan. I'm with the Organic Consumers Association, just like Catherine. So taking a step back, it seems like we've identified the problem, and to a certain extent we've identified the solution. We know what changes need to be made to our agricultural system. What would you say to us as consumer advocates about what we can do to encourage farmers and ranchers, anyone involved in agriculture, to actually make that change? What policies could be pushed? What consumer initiatives could be done to get that, to see that switch actually take place in the market and in the industry?
Is this to any particular person or
Any of
anybody?
you.
I'll have one comment. Buying and eating organic grass-finished beef or grass-finished anything. But and be careful, because grass fat and grass finished, grass fed, grass fat, grass finished is different. Grass fed means they fed it grass. Grass finished means the marbling in the meat, which means this critter's probably 28 months old, because you can't do it faster than that. So grass finished, and then there's no need for corn or chemicals. They can't use them.
Anybody else?
That's simple.
Here, I'll take a.
Here, go.
We have a campaign called Take Extinction Off Your Plate, and it encourages people to eat less meat, so a little bit different of an approach, but
so much of our land is used to grow feed for livestock, and by simply diminishing the amount of meat people eat, they can really decrease the burden on the land by eating a more plant-based diet and not requiring all that feed to be grown. Of course, there's still ethanol, and these issues are complicated, but eating lower on the food chain really does decrease the land that we use to grow corn and soy. And of course, corn and soy. And those people, when they think about commodity crops, they think like that's far away. Like commodity doesn't sound like something that comes on your plate, and so they have this like very dissociated attitude towards them, and they're not really thinking about the fact that those things are all drenched with pesticides, bioaccumulating in cows and chickens and everything else, and then coming out as glyphosate in our urine.
Do you still have a question? Do you still have a question? Okay.
Thanks so much for everyone's presentation. So I work more around agriculture, and one of the things that I track in my job is what agribusiness puts out as PR. And in particular, our focus, organization called Why Hunger, so we focus on hunger management. Food in the world. We need all these chemicals to grow as we get food. Make life is tough, and nature is against us. So that's the one myth. But then this myth of invasive species is very interesting. Kind of the opposite. Like nature is so good at living that it's a threat to us. So it's a contradictory message. And I'm just wondering how you all on the panel think that we should push back on these kind of like broad narratives, big communications messages to shift to an ecological perspective, because life the planet just gives. It seems like we just need the right relationship, and we'll get everything we need. So I'm just wondering if that's wondering what your thoughts are.
I've been saying little quip lately. I feel like we're kind of moving from the era of better living through chemistry to better living with biology. I feel like it's kind of a sea change where people are starting to see things and systems and not have this kind of linear association like this pest equals bad equals spray. That's been such a dominant ideology for about 60, 70 years or so. And I feel like people are coming at this and thinking about these issues on a much more deeper level. And I feel like it's part of our cultural evolution as a species. Like we're coming to realize that we have to interact with the world that sustains us in a different way, and realize that we're part of it, and that our actions matter. We can also shift things and do things to make things better, make the world more diverse. It just takes a little bit of ingenuity and a little bit of understanding of systems. They're not like complex topics. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
And I think it's really important. I think it's really important to point out all the time that right now we raise three times as many calories as is needed to feed all the people in the world. Yet there is still vast amounts of hunger. That question of feeding the world. It's just such a bogus one to prop up the chemical industries. There's a great movement going on to combat food waste and to really call attention to how much food gets. I think it's 40% in this country and a third around the world. So that's a really important thing. I think talking about how people actually get food is another really important thing. And I really enjoy pointing out when I'm talking about these farmers who are doing all this soil health stuff. They are raising, in many cases, they are raising more food than their neighbors. They are making more money than their neighbors. It's not a zero-sum game. They do all this great stuff and produce and especially some of these people who are so innovative about stacking enterprises. You know, they're not just growing a crop, but they're adding chickens and they're adding sheep, and all these things that they're doing are adding greater fertility to the land. So I think we can blow that one. I think we can blow that one out of the water.
And very practically, because I'm a very practical person, is I would like to give everybody a bricks meter. And when they're shopping, you have your bricks meter and you test the nutrient density of the food. So to have food and then to know what nutrients are in it, because all this food we raise has no nutrition in it. So zero. Like people use cell phones right now. And a bricks meter is you pinch the green bean, you pinch the green bean and it squishes between the screen and you look at it through the light and it shows you the nutrient density. It's very simple. Very simple. So a little gadget. You know how people love little gadgets. You could have it sticking on your cell phone and you pinch the green bean. It tells you what the nutrient density is, so you know not to buy the food that have no nutrients in it. Very simple. Very simple.
Oh, I was just gonna say what you already said about food waste being a huge issue. Yeah, I think about 13% of food that's wasted is meat. So all the resources that go into growing that is just vast acreages of land that we're throwing food away.
I just had one comment. You guys kind of related to what you guys were just talking about. I work in Norway, Maine, about an hour from here in the Center for Ecology-Based Economy, and we're just trying to localize our food system. And if we can get people to eat locally, it's their environment that's getting trashed, and people start putting pesticides on it. They care about that. They care about where their kids are going to play. They get to visit the farms. They know their farmers. The food is fresher. There's just so many functions that get stacked when your food is being grown locally and you have a relationship with your farmer.
Question for Lori. You mentioned some of the people.
Because I can't answer the question.
You mentioned some examples of some of the farmers who have stopped using pesticides and using a more systems approach. How did they come? Examples of how they came to that practice? Have they always used those, or switch over and adopt them later?
Most of the some of these older pioneers, these older innovators. I mean, they came to this method of farming because the old method didn't work. You know, because their land wasn't resilient, because they were failing. They were just failing. But I think that there is a whole. I mean, there's so many young people who want to go into farming, and I think that's a big issue. How to get the land, how to help them. But there are so many people coming in now who are following in their footsteps, starting off by doing all the right stuff. So that's really exciting for the right reasons.
I have a question. I don't know if any of you all can answer it, but this morning, Congresswoman Pingree, 1% ag budget is put to research on organics. Organic growing, and I wonder what percent of the ag budget is put to subsidies for organic, as opposed to subsidies for conventional.
I'm not aware of many subsidies for organic. As a person who does that, you have to pay for certification, and you have to track everything that you bring onto your farm. It's kind of a backwards system, in my opinion. You can apply anything you want. You don't have to pay. You don't have to track it.
I do.
Yeah.
I do know that fruits and vegetables are considered specialty crops under the Farm Bill, and they get 2% of subsidies. No, just the whole realm of fruits and vegetables.
Actually, I'd just like you to repeat what you said about the illness.
three levels.
Oh.
Grass-fed
meat, beef, but any of the grass-fed means at some point in time they have eaten grass. Grass finished means that they have fed them at such a period of time, like for cattle, it would be 28 months to get the marbling such that it's USDA choice. Because the marbling has to be in there to get to be that quality of flavor and taste. And that takes time. So grass finished means that it has gone all the way through and they've never had grain. If it's organic, no pesticides, no growth hormones. That's why it takes so long. Only have eaten grass and grazing. So grass-fed and grass finished are two very different things. Grass fat. Oh, they just got fat while they were eating, and maybe they had grass.
So grass finishes the whole life.
Their entire life. They have eaten grass and native pasture, and they have finished, which means you have to get the marbling. Finished means the marbling is there, which with corn you can do it in 30 days. You do it on grass, it takes 2 years.
It actually is shorter in the Northeast, or can be, depending on.
Depends on the cattle breed.
And also because
Absolutely.
we have a lot more lush grass. So, some people finish much well because there are certain breeds that do better.
Anyway, that's the in the bricks meters. In the bricks meters, BRIX.
Okay, I think maybe one more.
Nikita.
This question is for Orion. We all know about the neonics and how they behave systemically within plants and other pollen vector. So you mentioned a few other systemic chemicals in your presentation. And I was just wondering how big of a problem you think chemicals are and how you plan on addressing that presently and in the future.
Big problem. Continue to sue over the worst of them. I don't have an answer. I think we've heard a lot about the prophylactic approach to to pest management and how damaging that is, and the paradigm that comes out of, and how we need to get out of that paradigm. And it's just another level of that extreme paradigm where everything in a field must be deadly.
Okay, let's give the panel.